One of the greatest misunderstandings on the path of the soul is the belief that awakening is synonymous with bliss. There exists this romanticized fantasy that awakening is an experience of light, joy, and perpetual peace, as if one morning you simply rise from your bed with all burdens lifted, forever untouched by sorrow. But this is a dangerous illusion. True awakening is not a gentle breeze through the curtains. It is a storm that tears down the house. It does not elevate you gently into the heavens. It plunges you into the underworld, into the raw, dark chambers of the psyche that you have spent a lifetime avoiding. And this is precisely why most people, when they first begin to awaken, believe something has gone horribly wrong. They were promised illumination, but what they receive is devastation. They expected transcendence, but they are met with disintegration. 2. Awaken spiritually is not to be handed peace. It is to be handed a mirror, one that reflects not only your light but your wounds, your lies, your shadows. The image in that mirror is not something most are ready to face. For years, perhaps decades, we have built our identities carefully and with great effort. We have crafted roles: the successful professional, the good parent, the selfless friend, the spiritual seeker. These identities serve a function. They protect us, earn us love, help us survive. But they are not the truth of who we are. They are masks, and awakening tears those masks away, not with mercy but with necessity. It is this unmasking that people mistake for failure, when in truth it is the beginning of freedom. Imagine a woman named Elena. She has lived her life in control, structured, efficient. She meditates, she journals, she is admired. And then, one day without warning, the structure begins to crumble. Her routines feel meaningless. Her job, once her source of pride, feels hollow. She weeps without knowing why. Her body aches. Her dreams are filled with strange symbolic images. She's drowning, she's lost, she's giving birth to snakes. She goes to doctors, therapists, teachers, but no one can explain what's happening. Some say it's burnout, others call it depression. But Elena senses it is something deeper. She's being called, not upward, but inward. And yet, because she has been conditioned to associate awakening with peace, she believes something has gone wrong. She doesn't realize that what's breaking down is not her soul. It's the false life she built to protect it. This is where many turn back. They try to rebuild the mask, reassert control, return to the comfortable numbness. But those who turn back often live with a gnawing ache, because once the soul begins to wake, it will never fully sleep again. There's no unknowing the truth once it has made itself known. And the truth is this: awakening hurts. It unravels you. It takes away your certainty, your achievements, your carefully curated identity. But what it gives in return is something far more sacred. It gives you yourself. Awakening begins with ruin, it must, because what it seeks to reveal is hidden beneath layers of conditioning, shame, fear, and lies. You cannot reach the gold of the soul without first descending into the mine of the unconscious. The path is not up. It is down, inward, backward. The grief you feel when awakening is the grief of losing illusions that once felt like home. And the terror you feel is not a sign you're failing. It's a sign you're getting closer to the truth. In ancient myth, initiates were always led into darkness before they could emerge into light. Persephone was dragged into the underworld. Inanna passed through 7 gates, stripped of everything she owned. Even Christ descended into hell before resurrection. These stories were never metaphors for death alone. They were maps of awakening. But modern life has lost these symbols. We no longer have elders to guide us through the dark. So when people begin to awaken, and the world starts falling apart, they think they are dying, or breaking, or going mad. But in truth, they are being born. Real awakening is a death that leads to life. It is the death of who you thought you were and the birth of who you truly are. But birth is not gentle. Ask any mother. It is blood and pain and terror and surrender. The child does not slip out smiling. It emerges screaming. And so too does the soul when it begins its journey home. The reason most people never survive their awakening is not because they are weak or unworthy. It is because they were lied to. They were sold the idea that spiritual growth is neat, serene, and painless, and so when their world begins to collapse, they think they must have done something wrong. But if only they knew, if only they had been told that collapse is the sign not of failure but of initiation, then perhaps they would hold on through the storm, because after the collapse, something else begins. A quietness, a clarity, not the bliss of escape but the peace of truth. And in that truth one begins to feel whole, not because the world is perfect, but because the self is no longer divided. The war between the mask and the soul begins to end. The awakening that once felt like destruction is revealed as a beginning, not a comfortable one, but a true one. So let us not mistake the agony of awakening for a mistake. Let us not run from the fire that was sent to free us. Let us remember that the soul speaks in disruption, not in comfort. And let us remind those who are waking now that they are not alone. They are not broken, and they are not lost. They are on sacred ground, the ground of the self. And though it may feel like the end, it is in truth the beginning of everything real. To walk the path of spiritual awakening is to walk a road that appears, to the untrained eye, as madness. Not because it is senseless, but because it dismantles the very logic that society is built upon. You are no longer following the rules. You stop chasing the things that others worship, status, approval, possessions. You begin to hear a different voice inside you, one that contradicts everything you were taught to believe. And this voice doesn't shout. It whispers. It emerges only when you are quiet enough to hear it. But its message can be terrifying. Nothing outside of you will ever complete you. Nothing external will ever bring you home. The home you seek is within, and to find it, you must let go of everything you thought was real. This is the point where many begin to isolate themselves, not by choice, but by necessity. Conversations that once felt lively now seem hollow. Gatherings that used to feel warm now feel draining. You begin to see how much of life is performance, how much of what people call connection is a mutual agreement to remain asleep. So you withdraw, not to punish, not to avoid, but to listen more deeply. There is something inside you, call it the soul, the self, the eternal spark, that cannot be heard amid the noise of the world. And when this whisper begins to grow stronger, it pulls you away from everything superficial. People around you won't understand. They may say you've changed, they may say you're distant, cold, or lost, but in truth you are being found. It is just that the version of you they knew was a mask, a role, a fragment, and now, in your silence, in your solitude, something whole is beginning to form. The pain of this transformation is profound because we are relational creatures. We are wired to seek community, to belong. But the paradox of awakening is that to truly belong, you must first learn to stand alone. Only from wholeness can you connect without dependency. And wholeness is born in the dark, in the quiet, in the loneliness that feels like death. Consider a man named Thomas. He was always the life of the party, charming, confident, loved. His phone never stopped buzzing. His weekends were filled with dinners, drinks, and laughter. But beneath the charm was a deep ache, a sense of unworthiness he never dared to confront. One day, after a moment of profound loss, the ache could no longer be ignored. He tried to keep up appearances, but the laughter tasted sour. The conversations felt forced. Slowly, he began to withdraw. He spent more time walking alone, journaling, crying without knowing why. His friends called him and he didn't answer. They told him he was spiraling, but he wasn't spiraling. He was shedding. What they saw as decline was, in truth, transformation. He was no longer interested in playing the game. He wanted truth, and truth cannot be found in the noise. This withdrawal, this descent into solitude, is often the most misunderstood stage of awakening. It is not depression, though it may feel like it. It is not laziness, though it may appear that way to others. It is a sacred pause, a turning inward, a dismantling of the external self so that the internal self can emerge. In this space, we grieve. We grieve the life we no longer want. We grieve the identity we outgrew. We grieve the friendships that were built on falsehoods. And most painfully, we grieve the love we gave away hoping it would fill the emptiness inside us. But there is beauty in this sorrow, because the emptiness is not a void to be feared, it is the womb of rebirth. In the emptiness we discover that we are enough, not because we are perfect, but because we are real. And in being real, we are free. Free from the need to perform. Free from the need to please. Free from the prison of our own expectations. This stage of awakening, this painful, quiet unraveling, is where many turn back. They panic. They confuse the death of the ego with the death of the self. They run to therapists, to pills, to distractions, begging for the old self to return. But the old self is gone and it must remain gone, because it was never the truth. It was a survival strategy, a collection of adaptations, a mask worn to be loved in a world that fears authenticity. And now, stripped bare, you face the rawness of your being. You feel like a newborn, fragile, uncertain, naked before the mystery of existence. And yet, in this fragility there is immense power, because nothing is more dangerous to the false world than a person who has nothing left to lose. When you are no longer afraid of your own darkness, you are no longer controllable. When you have sat in your own silence and made peace with your pain, you no longer need validation. And when you have stopped running from yourself, you become a mirror for others, terrifying to some, healing to others. The reason most people never survive this stage of awakening is not because they are weak. It is because they are too deeply entangled in their roles. They fear the judgment of others more than they crave the truth. They mistake numbness for peace and performance for love. And so they retreat, not into themselves, but back into the mask. They call it healing, but it is really forgetting. They speak of balance, but it is really avoidance. And they live out the rest of their days as echoes of who they might have been, had they only stayed a little longer in the dark. But for those who remain, for those who trust the silence, who allow the unraveling, who dare to stand alone, the rewards are immense. Not in the way society defines success, not in riches or fame or constant happiness, but in something deeper, something eternal, a stillness, a knowing, a rootedness in the self that can never again be shaken. You do not need to explain this process to anyone. Those who have walked the path will recognize you, and those who have not will project their fears onto you. That is their journey. Yours is to walk faithfully, to trust the fire even when it burns, to embrace the solitude even when it aches. Because in that fire, something sacred is being forged, and in that solitude, a voice is beginning to speak. The voice of your truest self, calling you home. The moment you begin to see through the illusions you've lived by, when the world you once trusted starts to crumble, there is a visceral panic that sets in. It is not intellectual. It is not theoretical. It is primal. The ground beneath your feet begins to shift, and everything you clung to for stability, the beliefs, relationships, routines, and even your name, suddenly feels uncertain. That is the moment many begin to turn back. Not because they want to live a lie, but because the truth terrifies them. The spiritual awakening strips away every certainty, and in its place it offers you nothing, at least at first. Most people do not survive this process because they were taught, since childhood, to value order over chaos, clarity over ambiguity, and security over growth. They were trained to believe that discomfort is a sign something is wrong, rather than a sign something is being born. So when the discomfort comes, when the disorientation intensifies, they assume they've made a mistake. They look for an escape route, a way to silence the discomfort. Some return to old relationships that never nurtured them. Others drown themselves in busyness or distractions, mistaking movement for progress. The bravest among them might seek therapy, hoping to fix the pain. But the pain isn't meant to be fixed. It's meant to be felt. It is the language of the soul, telling you that something within you is trying to come alive. There's a story about a woman named Layla. Her awakening began with a sudden, unexplained sadness. She had a steady job, a caring partner, and all the markers of success. Yet she would wake up each morning with tears in her eyes. No event had triggered, and no trauma had resurfaced. It was as if her soul had grown tired of pretending. At first she ignored it. She told herself she was just burned out. She took a vacation, she tried yoga. She even got a new haircut. But the sadness followed her like a shadow. It wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Eventually she stopped, fighting it. She sat with it, and what she heard in that silence was staggering. This life is not yours. Her identity, carefully curated over decades, was a performance. She had become who she thought she was supposed to be. She had abandoned who she truly was. And now that truth was clawing its way to the surface. This is where the spiritual awakening becomes dangerous. Because once you see the false self, you can't unsee it. But you're not yet strong enough to live from your true self. You're in limbo. You can't go back, and you don't yet know how to go forward. And this in-between, the void, is unbearable for most. It feels like death. And in a way, it is. The death of the ego, the death of the persona, the death of everything you built on sand. And like any death, it comes with grief. But no one teaches us how to grieve our own identity. No one tells us that letting go of who we thought we were is the greatest loss of all. At this point in the journey, you may find yourself alone, not because people abandoned you, but because you no longer fit into the world you once belonged. 2. Conversations feel artificial. Small talk feels suffocating. Your tolerance for inauthenticity dwindles. You crave depth, silence, stillness. And yet, your old self clings like a ghost, whispering doubts. You're going crazy. You're ruining your life. No one understands you. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps no one does. But that's not a reason to turn back. It's a sign that you're finally becoming real. The spiritual awakening is a process of disintegration. And disintegration is terrifying because it defies everything we were taught to value. We were raised to build, to accumulate, to construct identities, not to dismantle them. But the soul doesn't care about your resume. It doesn't care how many followers you have or how impressive your lifestyle appears. It cares only for truth. And truth is not shiny or marketable. It is raw. It is messy. It is often found in tears and silence and long nights of doubt and despair. There's a man named Samuel who built his entire life around being the provider. He prided himself on being dependable, rational, grounded. His family looked to him for strength. His friends admired his composure, but inside he felt hollow. Every achievement felt meaningless. Every compliment felt like a lie. And then one day, during a routine business trip, he found himself unable to get out of bed. Not because he was physically ill, but because something inside him had broken. He described it later as an internal collapse. For weeks, he drifted between sleep and waking, unable to explain what was happening. He thought he was losing his mind, but he wasn't. He was losing the false self. The mask of invincibility was falling, and for the first time in his life he felt fragile and, therefore, human. Most people never survive their spiritual awakening because they confuse ego death with actual death. They think that if the old self is gone, then nothing remains. But that is a lie. What remains is the real you, the one you lost somewhere, between childhood and adulthood. The one who knew how to cry, to laugh, to sit still, to imagine. The one who wasn't trying to be anyone, but simply was. That self doesn't emerge quickly. It comes slowly, like dawn breaking after a long, dark night. And in the meantime, you must learn to sit in the darkness without reaching for the light. You must learn to be empty without rushing to fill yourself. The spiritual path is not glamorous. It will not always make you feel good. It will often ruin your plans. It may alienate you from the people you love. It may take away your career, your identity, your illusions of control, but it will give you something greater: freedom. Freedom from the need to pretend. Freedom from the fear of judgment. Freedom from the compulsive search for validation. And in that freedom, There is peace, not the peace of a quiet afternoon or a gentle breeze, but the peace of alignment, of truth, of knowing who you are when everything else has fallen away. And so the question is not whether you are strong enough to survive your awakening. The question is whether you are willing to let go of everything that is not truly you. Most are not. Most would rather suffer in the comfort of illusion than risk the pain of becoming. But if you are among the few, if you are willing to let it all burn, then something sacred awaits you on the other side. Not answers, not certainty, but authenticity. And from that soil, everything real begins to grow. There comes a moment in the spiritual journey when all external reference points vanish. The roles, labels, and accomplishments that once gave life meaning dissolve into silence. You no longer know what you're supposed to do, who you're supposed to be, or why anything mattered in the first place. This collapse of meaning is not a failure. It is an initiation. But most people do not recognize it as such. They panic. They interpret the absence of clarity as a sign of madness, not as the threshold of awakening. And in their haste to reclaim certainty, they abandon the path just when they're on the edge of transformation. In the early stages of awakening, people seek guidance, symbols, systems, anything to help them make sense of what's unfolding. This is understandable. After all, we are meaning-making creatures. But there comes a point when the symbols fail. The language of doctrine, the comfort of spiritual communities, even the practices that once brought peace, meditation, prayer, ritual begin to feel hollow. You kneel in prayer and feel nothing. You meditate for hours and touch only emptiness. You seek signs from the universe and are met with silence. This silence is not the absence of divinity. It is divinity stripped of your expectations. It is truth that refuses to dress itself in the clothes of your conditioning. Most cannot survive this phase because it dismantles the very tools they believed would save them. It is disorienting to realize that the map no longer leads anywhere, that the words of teachers no longer resonate, that the universe seems indifferent to your questions. And yet this disorientation is the necessary dark night of the soul. It is the moment when the true self begins to stir beneath the ruins of the constructed self. Imagine a man named Eli who spent 20 years climbing the ladder of spiritual achievement. He attended every retreat, mastered every technique, memorized every sacred text. He was revered in his community, admired for his insight and calm. But one morning, without warning, it all collapsed. The words felt empty. The rituals felt meaningless. He could no longer pretend. Panic set in. He doubted his path, his wisdom, even his sanity. Was it all a lie? He asked himself. Did I just waste 20 years chasing shadows? But it wasn't a waste. It was a necessary scaffolding. What collapsed wasn't the truth. It was the image of truth he had built with his mind. In the deeper layers of awakening, the ego discovers. It cannot control the soul's unfolding. It cannot dictate the timing, the form, or the direction. And this powerlessness is unbearable to a mind conditioned to dominate. The ego wants to turn awakening into a project, a linear path with measurable results. But the soul is not interested in efficiency. It is interested in depth, and depth cannot be rushed. It must be endured. This endurance is where most falter, because endurance requires surrender, and surrender requires trust in something you cannot yet name. It asks you to release the illusion of progress, to let go of the metrics that once defined your worth. This terrifies people. We were taught to measure everything: success, growth, happiness. But the soul grows in silence, in the dark, in the absence of applause. It grows when nothing seems to be happening. And that nothing is often the most sacred ground. During this void, relationships begin to shift. The people who once reflected your old identity begin to fall away. Some do so gently, others with violence. Friends become strangers. Family no longer understands. The connection is gone, not because they changed, but because you did. And here is where another deep sorrow arises, the sorrow of isolation. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from not being seen. You may try to explain what you're going through, but words fail. You speak and they nod, but they don't understand. How could they? They're still living in the world that you have now seen through. This is the crucible. It is not the darkness that breaks people. It is the loneliness. To walk the path alone, to feel unseen, unheld, misunderstood. That is what causes so many to retreat. They long for the comfort of community, but community often requires conformity. And you can no longer conform, not because you're rebellious, but because your soul refuses to wear a mask again. There was a woman named Mira who left her corporate job after a profound awakening. She could no longer participate in a system built on competition and exploitation. She had no plan, no savings, no roadmap, just a deep knowing that she could not continue betraying herself. At first, she was celebrated for her courage. But as the months passed and her struggle deepened, the praise turned to concern. Friends urged her to be practical. Her family called her decisions irresponsible. The deeper she went into herself, the further she drifted from others. One night, alone in her apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and unanswered texts, she broke down. Not from regret, but from the sheer weight of carrying truth alone. She survived because she stopped trying to explain herself. She realized that her awakening was not a public performance, it was an internal revolution, and revolutions are rarely understood while they're happening. The truth is, awakening deconstructs before it reconstructs. It unearths all that is false before it reveals what is real. And that unearthing feels like destruction. You lose your footing. You lose your place in the world. You even lose your language. But what you gain error in message stream, there is a breaking point on the path of awakening that few anticipate, the collapse of the inner narrative. Up until this moment, even amidst spiritual upheaval, the individual holds on to a quiet story, a silent expectation that awakening will eventually lead to peace, clarity, happiness, or a sense of specialness. But real awakening does not reward the ego with a crown. It burns the crown, the throne, and the kingdom to ashes. It strips away the comfort of being the one who is awakening and leaves you face to face with something unimaginably vast, impersonal, and often terrifying in its silence. It is not the loss of your illusions that breaks you. It is the loss of the identity built upon those illusions. Most people never survive their spiritual awakening because they do not know how to live without a story. The story of being a seeker, a healer, a wounded one, a chosen one. These become garments that we wear so long that we mistake them for skin. And when they are torn away, we stand naked in front of the truth, shivering, exposed, and desperate to put something, anything back on, but there is no going back. That's the thing. Once the veil is lifted, no matter how desperately the ego tries to sew it shut again, the rupture has occurred. And in that rupture, the individual must make a harrowing decision: to surrender to the death of identity, or to retreat into a more sophisticated illusion dressed as spirituality. Let me tell you about Jonah. He was a man who had undergone a profound awakening experience during a meditation retreat. For weeks afterward, he walked around in what he described as a state of blissful detachment. I felt like I was floating above the world, he said. I saw through all the illusions and nothing could touch me. But slowly, life began to return with its claws. His relationships strained under the weight of his detachment. His job, which once felt meaningless, now felt suffocating. He tried to maintain the high of his awakening, but reality demanded participation. The bliss faded, replaced by anxiety and confusion. If I was truly awake, he asked, why do I feel more lost than before? Because awakening is not an escape from reality, it is a deeper plunge into it. It is not a bypass of suffering, but an invitation to meet suffering without defense. It does not elevate you above the world. It drags you into its heart, where the blood, the sorrow, and the beauty all coexist without separation. Jonah thought awakening was the end of his pain. What he discovered was that it was the end of his ability to avoid pain. And that realization shattered him. This is the secret no one tells you, that true awakening is not about becoming more peaceful, it's about becoming more real, more alive, more undefended. And with that comes the full spectrum of experience, not just joy and light, but rage, grief, confusion, and the unbearable beauty of a world that is both sacred and cruel. The spiritual ego promises transcendence, but the soul wants embodiment, and embodiment hurts. People retreat at this stage because the tools they relied upon stop working. Affirmations feel hollow. Mantras are mechanical. Even silence becomes oppressive. Nothing numbs the sharp edge of reality anymore. And in that raw exposure, many decide it is better to build a new identity, one that appears spiritual, but is still rooted in control. They speak of surrender, but manipulate outcomes. They preach detachment, but are addicted to praise. They claim awakening, but fear the quiet moments when no one is watching. Surviving a spiritual awakening requires the willingness to be undone, to fall apart without rushing to fix it, to let go of all the frameworks that once gave you comfort, and dare to exist in the vastness without scaffolding. It means trusting the descent as much as the ascent, trusting the emptiness, not as a punishment, but as a sacred space where something utterly unknown might be born. A woman named Selene once told me that the hardest part of her awakening was not the loss of friends or the anxiety, or even the depression. It was the loss of ambition. I used to have so many goals, she said. I wanted to build a business, write a book, change the world. But now, nothing feels urgent. I just want to sit and listen to the wind in the trees. And I hate it, because I feel like I'm disappearing. And, in a way, she was disappearing. Not the soul, but the persona. The driven, productive, admired woman was dissolving, and in her place was something quieter, more spacious, harder to define. And that, too, is terrifying, to no longer fit into the world's mold of success, and to not yet know who you are without it. This is why few survive their awakening. Because survival, in this case, doesn't mean staying alive. It means staying open. Open when everything inside you wants to shut down. Open when no one understands you. Open when the silence stretches for days and no insight comes. Open when you feel like a ghost in your own life. Open when the old self is dying and the new self has not yet emerged. It is in this in-between space, the liminal zone, that the greatest danger lies. Not because it is inherently destructive, but because the ego cannot survive here. And so it fights. It resurrects old habits, toxic relationships, escapist fantasies. It bargains. Just let me feel in control again. Just give me something solid to hold. But awakening is not a negotiation. It is an initiation, and those who pass through it, who resist the urge to build a new persona too quickly, who allow themselves to be reshaped by the mystery, emerge not as better versions of their old selves, but as something entirely new. Not an image, not a role, but a presence, a being. A soul finally freed from the tyranny of its own self-concept. If you find yourself here now, raw and lost and trembling in the dark, stay. Stay without answers. Stay without certainty. Stay without the comfort of your former self. For in this sacred undoing, something deeper is being born. And though you may not recognize it yet, it is you. The you that has always been waiting beneath the noise. In the final stage of spiritual awakening, the one that few reach and even fewer remain within, the seeker becomes still, not because they have found all the answers, but because they have finally stopped asking the wrong questions. There comes a moment, subtle and profound, when the inner chaos quiets not through suppression, but through understanding. When the hunger to become someone dissolves into the calm realization that one simply is. Here, the awakening matures. It is no longer a flame that burns wildly through the forest. It becomes the earth that holds the ashes. This stage is not dramatic. There are no fireworks, no proclamations of enlightenment, no grand declarations to the world. In fact, from the outside, it may appear that nothing has changed. The person rises in the morning, washes their face, goes to work, talks to their children, eats dinner, and goes to sleep. But inside, the tectonic plates of being have shifted. They have moved from survival to presence, from grasping to allowing, from fear to quiet participation. One might imagine that by this point, life becomes easy, blissful even. But that is a misunderstanding born from the ego's need to romanticize peace. Life continues to present its thorns. Loved ones die, dreams fail, illness strikes. Yet the relationship to these events is no longer dictated by panic or resistance. It is met with the wide, accepting eyes of a soul no longer afraid of its own depth. There was a man I once knew, Elias, who had walked through fire, abandonment, addiction, bankruptcy, the suicide of his brother. He had pursued awakening like a drowning man reaches for air, and he found it not in a monastery or retreat, but in the wreckage of his own breakdown. He told me, I kept waiting for life to stop hurting. But instead, I learned how to stop hurting myself with the idea that it shouldn't. That sentence lingered with me for years. Stop hurting myself with the idea that it shouldn't. How many of us suffer not because of what happens, but because of the belief that it shouldn't happen? We cling to expectations, fantasies, and images of how life ought to be. And when reality does what it always does, unfolds according to its own mystery, we fight it, we scream, we collapse. But the one who has survived the full arc of awakening no longer wages war with the unfolding. They do not escape into false positivity or sink into nihilism. They walk the middle path, the one that is almost invisible. They weep when there is loss, laugh when there is joy, and remain silent when there is nothing to say. They are no longer ruled by the inner tyrant demanding constant improvement, constant becoming. They rest in being. This rest is not laziness. It is the most active form of trust. It is the trust that even when nothing makes sense, the ground beneath is holding you. It is the trust that even if all structures collapse, the essence remains. And it is this trust that most cannot bear because it means letting go of control. In the modern world, where control is the God we silently worship, control over time, over outcomes, over perception, surrender appears weak. But to the one who has awakened fully, surrender is the ultimate strength. It is the place where resistance ends and real vision begins. This final stage also brings with it an almost unbearable aloneness. Not loneliness in the conventional sense, but a profound solitude of spirit. The awakened one realizes that no one can accompany them fully into their own depths. There are no teachers left to follow, no systems to depend on, no dogma to cling to. It is just the soul and the mystery, face to face. And yet, paradoxically, this solitude births compassion. Because once you have walked through the valley of your own shadow and survived, you can no longer judge others for stumbling in theirs. You see the pain behind the rage, the fear beneath the arrogance, the longing beneath the numbness. You no longer seek to fix people. You simply sit with them in the fire, knowing how vital it is to be witnessed without correction. There was a woman named Mira who spent most of her life seeking gurus. She traveled across continents collecting teachings like rare gems. But the more she sought, the emptier she became. It wasn't until her teacher died suddenly, and no one remained to tell her what to do, that she finally turned inward. 4 months. She sat in her small apartment in silence. No rituals, no mantras, no spiritual friends. Just her breath, her pain, and her awareness. And in that emptiness, something ancient stirred. When I met her years later, I asked her if she missed the intensity of the journey. She smiled and said, "The journey never ends. It just stops screaming." That is what most people do not understand. Awakening is not a peak to be reached. It is a homecoming. And that home is not outside of you. It is the still point within, the place that has never changed, even as everything around it has. In the end, those who survive their awakening do, so not because they are stronger or smarter or more spiritual. They survive because they stop running. They stop resisting the truth of what is. They surrender not to defeat, but to the sacredness of life exactly as it is. Raw, imperfect, radiant. And it is in that surrender that the greatest paradox unfolds. The very thing you were afraid to lose, your sense of self, is what you never needed to protect. Because beneath it, beyond it, was something vaster, more enduring, and more real than you could have ever imagined. You are not the seeker. You are what the seeker is seeking. You are not the storm. You are the sky it moves through. You are not awakening. You are awake. You always were. You simply forgot. And now you remember.